offer something to that individual that those in the vertical identity don't, and vice versa. So trying to find out because a lot of the times part of that reaction is, feeling not as important or especially in important pieces of their life, but what is it that they have given their child that only they have been able to give them, and highlighting that and talking about how that child is using that even in his or her explorations of the vertical identity. So they're choosing different things, but why? Have they given them a safe enough childhood where they feel able to do that? So that's one thing that they've given them. Or that sense of bravery or courage or connecting or valuing other people. Maybe an important lesson that parents give them is empathy and trying to show kindness to other people. And so they're starting to express that in the vertical identity. Find those both and connections. And it's never going to, so it may never be where the child's going to be exactly what the parent wants to be, but if they can see where their influence has been and how the child is expressing that influence, that helps to usually lower defense enough, able to make a connection more readily, and tends to open the space for some dialogue. So I value independence and egalitarian interactions. This family does not. That's like polar opposite. That's usually not as helpful. And this is long-winded, but I value independence over interdependence. I place a higher priority on egalitarian interactions than on respect for authority in most situations. This family places a higher value on respect for the wisdom and decision of elders, more often probably. They place a high value on interdependence, family cohesion, and preservation of cultural and religious traditions. That helps place the family in a more favorable light. It's more true, as opposed to they don't value egalitarian relationships. Right? What do they value? So that leads into this idea of traditionalism in a lot of families, and it's seen as a polar opposite, binary, right? So to come from like a competency-based, culturally responsive approach is doing what we've been doing. You deconstruct this idea of, when families say or when kids say about their family, well, they're very traditional about things. Well, can you give me some examples of that? And have they always made that decision in that way, or have they make the same decisions with all the siblings or not all the siblings, and kind of expand the conversation. A lot of the times in a lot of therapy, many times I think we've been taught to narrow the conversation. It's always kind of like trying to pinpoint what's going on. But what I found more helpful is to expand it, like offer different questions, open the conversation to different possibilities. And then something seems to be able to connect with the family more readily. So I'm going to give a couple examples from Latino families, but definitely applicable in some ways to others. So I talked about this, right? Familismo, Latino families valuing family connections, right? So one of the ways that we see this that I've talked about is family stories. Family stories can be really important. They're a way to share knowledge, experiences, lessons, and sometimes instead of asking questions about what's going on with the child or with the parents, sometimes it's helpful to ask for examples of stories. Can you tell me of a time, or what have you know? What was he like growing up, or what was she like growing up, or tell me what it's like when you all get together for families. You'll have a funny story about that, or what stories always come up. You're just kind of expanding, inviting the family to discuss family stories. Is one way to do this. And I talked about this already. So for some families, this idea of enmeshment may not be culturally appropriate, right? Depending on the family, or the sense of overdependence, right? Because they may value relatedness in a different way, right, the families. Um, the parent-child dyad may persist throughout the lifespan in different ways than what is more traditionally thought of in your lifespan class, right? Your developmental psychology class, where when you individuate and you become 20 or something and you go off, then now, the parent's authority shifts, which we all may feel that seems like to be the thing in our society. I always said when I was 18, I'm moving out, and I did. But for some families, that parental-child authority, even when they have their own families and children, can persist in certain areas. Those parents' decisions are still taken into consideration when that adult child is making decisions about his or her family or his or her children, right, in ways that others don't. So those alliances have to be looked at contextually. Right? For example, you have an adult son still living at home. Maybe he's 30, he's unmarried. That person may see themselves completely autonomous. If you ask him what his life is like, he has his own work, he has his own life, he has his own friends. He may not see it as dependent, or enmeshed at all. He may feel that he's very autonomous, depending on the examples that he cites, right? So it depends. Also, this idea of personalismo, in a lot of families, is like I talked about stories. It's important for some families to get to know you on a more personal level. Not all families, and not all Latino families, but a lot of the times. So there's the value, bless you, of what we would call like small talk. Taking some time to do that. Now, personable does not mean informal, right? Sometimes in our society, that's what we think of. We think, oh, personal, okay, and then we kind of relax. And there's definitely a distinction. And a lot of families will still want to hold you in a certain respect because of your position, right? So it doesn't mean they're going to be informal, but definitely personable. Like I said, like we would see it as small talk, right, or plática, and being indirect in their discussion of their story. So they all of a sudden may come up with a story that may seem related and kind of seem like a tangent, and not as related. I would listen to those stories. There may be something the family's trying to tell you about, their children or their situation. And I would respond indirectly as well. Like, a lot of the times therapy values direct conversation. Say what you mean. And for a lot of people, it is helpful for them to learn to do that because they've been very avoidant in their life and they haven't owned up, right? So that can be helpful in a lot of ways. But for some families, but that's not a hard and fast rule all the time because some families communicate in indirect ways. So to correct that may be culturally inappropriate. To respond indirectly may be an appropriate way. So, a woman is trying to get a day off from her employer, but she tells a story about how her husband is saying that, the family really needs a weekend, and they're going to be their anniversary, but she's in process of telling the story. She's telling her employer, but I told him that that's the busiest weekend. You really need me here. I'm telling him we can't do that. That he has to understand that my job is very important to me. So what is she doing? She's trying to ask for the time off, right? And if you listen in indirect, so if that's the way someone communicates, it's not necessarily our job to say, well, if that's what you mean, then say directly what you mean. Not necessarily. If you can understand the indirect, because there is a sense of pride in there. There's a sense of being hospitable, There's a sense of appropriateness. Remember I talked about accuracy? Did I talk about that? The accuracy of words? Did I say that yet? Maybe? And appropriateness? Well, it may not be appropriate in her mind to be accurate about what she's saying. That's the employer. You want to be respectful in some ways. And why should I? Shouldn't you understand that that's what I'm asking for anyway? But we all have these social conventions. Someone's like, well, Someone can think, well, that's a lot of social dance. That's a lot of games to play. Well, we all have those games when we interact with bosses or parents or teachers. They may not be as noticeable, in our context, but we all have those social mores and frameworks that we operate from. So, looking at the appropriateness of what's being said, understanding that directness may not be the only way to come across in a healthy manner. And so some ways to look at that as, there's this notion of fatalism, like just not being willing, accepting one's lot in life for some families. And we see this a lot in a lot of lower income families. The people have accused a lot of lower income families of kind of just being fatalistic. But another reframe of that is a coping style, coping mechanisms. If you know you're locked in to a certain economic status in your life, would it be healthy to bang your head against that every single day, all the time, and be completely, totally stressed about it? Or do you need to save your energy to raising your kids or getting through the day? And so that whole thing of that's just my lot in life, And what's happening when somebody does that is that they're choosing to put their energies in other places. It's a very brilliant coping mechanism for these families, right? Or it can be very fatalistic. It's a matter of what you choose, what you want to choose to believe, and how you want to choose to see the families. Both of them can empirically be true. Both of them. It depends on what you think is more helpful. That's why I call them helpful conversations. It's always like, what's helpful? That's always the thing. What's most helpful? Is it always helpful to be right or correct in a moment all the time? Or is it more helpful to be helpful to families? A lot of families and a lot of Latino families and other cultural minority families are seen as passive a lot of times, as opposed to, like I mentioned before, being hospitable. Maybe they don't want to violate a sense of being of hospitality or respect. Maybe that's more important to them than being assertive in the moment, in that context. I've talked about this enmeshment, familialism. Both of them could be true. What's most helpful? I'm going to go through this because I've been talking a lot about that already. We talked a lot about nonverbal communication as well. But so personal space is something you see. How many of you had experiences with different families having different norms of personal space? Yeah. Some of them want to be really close, some of them want to be really far. I've had both. Have you had anyone refuse to shake your hand? That's happened to me. Like just like you're offering, they're like not offering, and they're like, okay. All right, that's fair. Some of these very basic values of communication aren't thought about by the families or ourselves until they're violated, until somebody crosses that line. Which is why even with ourselves and sometimes with families, there may be this reaction that seems completely justified and appropriate, but if we think about it, we don't know exactly why we're reacting in that way, or they may not know why they're reacting in that way. And that's what happens when taken for granted social norms become violated sometimes, when crossed. We have an emotional reaction. So we do need to understand what, if the counselor backs away or if the family backs away. If we back away, it may seem as, right? And, well, that's not fair to some of the families. Well, that's because we're in a position of power, right? No matter how, how much we may, and even families may value certain egalitarianism, we are in a position of power. We're not going to go there to talk about our family. right? I mean, we can do a little self-disclosure sometimes or a little relationship building, but we're not there to resolve our stuff, right? Or we're going to focus on them, and they know that. We always have that position of power all the time. As much as some of us may want to give that up, it's always there. So, understanding the context of level of closeness, greetings, reactions, I think, is important. Same thing with bodily movements. In some Asian cultures, Filipino cultures, and even in some Latino cultures, smiling can mean discomfort or embarrassment, but not always embarrassment for them. Sometimes they're embarrassed for you. This happens a lot with school suspensions and school disciplines with some children from different cultural backgrounds that value this. It's very, particularly with some Native American tribes, it's very culturally, you don't even think about it, appropriate that if you're getting in trouble by an authority figure, you smile. You smile because you're feeling discomfort, and so you don't want to react in any way. So the most neutral, pleasing facial expression is a smile because you're getting in trouble. Now, if a teacher or principal sees you smiling at them while you're getting after them, what do you think they're going to do? I mean, they're going to think they're not being taken seriously, disrespectful, right? So this is important, eye contact. For many white Americans, European Americans, we value eye contact to show someone's listening. But if you look at some of your friends, the opposite is true when that person is talking. For a lot of white Americans, when they're talking, they don't make eye contact. They kind of look somewhere else. But to show that they're listening, but when they stop talking and they listen, then they make eye contact with the speaker. For a lot of African Americans, eye contact when someone is listening is the cultural opposite. You don't make eye contact when someone's listening. It could be disrespectful. It could be a sign of hostility sometimes. So you look down, you look away, and it looks like you're not paying attention. Now, remember, these subtle cultural values, none of these individuals consciously think that when it's happening. They may not even realize they're doing it. It's something you've learned in interactions as a child growing up. You don't even realize that you're doing it sometimes until it's pointed out. So no one's thinking, okay, I'm not going to make eye contact anymore. I mean, so when someone else notices it's different and they point it out, you're like, what are you talking about? I'm not doing that. Like it can have a reaction, right? Because it's so part of who the person is. Some cultures like to hug when they greet, depending on where they're at. It doesn't matter the gender or how new you are, you just met. And a lot in our mainstream society, we just usually don't do that when we first meet somebody, most of the time. But some do. And when that's different, then we notice it and we react to it, sometimes in a surprised way. I went away to college. I'm from San Antonio. I went away to college in my freshman year, and I'm glad that this experience happened because, it's one example of this. I never really considered myself like really big on like Texas pride, right? Like I was never anti that, but it just, being in Texas, you see and you hear a lot of people. More often than not, there's a continuum of how often you really love Texas or what, It's just part of what makes the state distinct, right? So, but I never felt like I was completely like this really pro-Texas, like all the time, not pro-Texas, just like, heightened Texan, I don't know what you call it, talking about this all the time, right? Never got that reaction growing up with anybody, never saw myself that way, never could think of examples that way. One of my suite mates was from Long Island, and to this day, this is the subtlety of things that are embedded in us. To this day, I have no recollection at all what we were talking about. I don't know what we were saying before. I don't have I can't remember. All I remember is him saying, "Why do you get so defensive about Texas?" And that shocked me so much that that's what I remember. Like, what? Because I never had that feeling in myself. And it surprised me so much that it shocked the memory out of me of like what we were talking about before. Because I'm like, I couldn't have been saying something that, Texas or whatever. I just never, but he noticed it from New York. He noticed something because he really reacted. So when someone calls us on something sometimes, it's natural sometimes to be defensive or to be upset or even deny something. But if somebody notices something and they're fairly, you can fairly trust them, but we have to look at that. That is a great lesson of self-awareness for me because I would completely have denied that the rest of my life. But somebody noticed, and even if it's not completely, I was saying something, he reacted to something. I did it. It was part of me. It was part of that conversation in some way that I don't believe. But it was there. Those are the subtleties of the communications, and that's why sometimes when those boundaries are violated or crossed, we can have reactions. We react to them either internally or verbally. Does that make sense? Okay. So I'm going to stop for a little while. See if anybody has anything.
I'm just glad that you brought up the African American culture and like the lack of eye contact sometimes, or what seems like to me culturally a lack of eye contact. I think that's important for me to know because I think in the past I thought they just maybe my clients that were African American who looked away, I would have thought that they were, and I did think they were disagreeing with what I was saying, or not valuing what I had to say, or feeling a lack of connection with me.
Right.
So it's good to know that that's not something to think about, but not something to automatically assume.
Exactly. That might not have been the case necessarily. It is a very common interaction style, particularly with males, African American males, particularly with African American males. It can happen. Sometimes it can happen from the beginning of the interaction to the end of the interaction, where there's no eye contact when the speaker is talking, so that is not an indication of disagreement or agreement. It might be, but it's not necessarily.
Do you think that has its roots in oppression?
Yes, I think it does. I think it has its roots in, like in other Asian countries in a different way, looking someone in the eye is disrespectful. And in some Latin American countries, and then U.S. Latinos, for some children, looking the teacher in the eye is disrespectful because you're equaling your authority. You're showing that you're going to disagree with something. And so in that way, it's a respect for authority. I think for African Americans in particular with slavery, the roots of that oppression, it could also be they weren't allowed to, and definitely not something. And again, nobody, that individual person's not going to know that. It's just communication styles that are passed down and passed down and passed down and passed down.
What do you think about, when thinking about a teen boy that I see, I feel like lots of times there are assumptions made about him, especially at school and things based on the way that he dresses or his quietness even.
Yeah.
So sometimes I struggle with, especially today, kind of thinking about with wanting to understand what parts of that are cultural for him, dressing like his peers and things like that. But then also wanting to give him skills so that these same things don't keep happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How to respect that, but also help him have tools that he's not, the same things don't keep happening because people are making assumptions or are,
Right.
I don't know, it seems like some of those things are what lead him to getting into trouble or things or misunderstandings. And
Yeah. I think as much as possible offering choices in his response, and this is not a one conversation or one suggestion, interaction. So what I'm going to say is obviously abbreviated and obviously just kind of hitting the main points. But so offering him opportunities in how he's going to respond, and several ways to think about that. And one could be, and you may have done this, is what is it that you think the teachers, are wanting. Like, what's their problem? Why are they giving you such a hard time? What is it that they're seeing or not seeing that, that is are making them kind of treat you this way? Like, what are they stuck on? Like, what's wrong with them? And what are they, it's like, well, they probably want this. He might say that. He's quiet, so he might know, right? Another thing might be just asking him, so this, this is happening to you, or this getting in trouble to you. And so, is that something that, I can't say it, you say it differently, but the basic idea is that something that you want? Is that like, are you kind of okay with this stuff happening, or would it be, better if you were like at a different school, would you want something different to be happening? Does he care? Does he not care? He cares, but pointing out a lot of what he's getting that other people aren't getting, and securing that piece will allow him to maybe branch out and do other behaviors. So if he's really quiet, what is he hearing that other kids aren't hearing? What does he pay attention to? What does he notice about other people that his peers don't, or most other people, or even the teachers don't? Find that, enlarge that, build on that as a skill, as a competency. And then what other things could he do? If he can do that really well, I wonder if maybe what would happen if he did, respond or speak out if he's quiet. I'm not exactly. What might happen? How do you think they would react to that? What do you think they say? A lot of adolescents, a lot of them are game for some experimentation. So as an experiment. Like, I wonder if one time if they did that and you said something, let me know what they say when you speak up or when you do something different. Let's just see how they respond to it. Let me know. So you're kind of in on something and they do something different and you just kind of try something out. Does that make sense?
Sure. So I guess it's okay. I guess I feel like skills isn't like disrespecting the things that make our part is his being way out respectful. Does that make sense? Like fighting or things like that. Helping him kind of work within this culture of school or other things is not negating or minimizing the importance of those skills.
Right. That's why you start with complementing those skills first and building it up and talking about it as a competency and valued, and you value it, he values it, his family values it, and it's there, it's solid, it's important, it's valued, it's, all the strengths behind it. He's also getting in trouble. He's also having a hard time. So let's just try this thing maybe one time next week and let's just see what happens. So not telling him to disregard, but in the spirit of, probably not having a great time with that, and just in the adolescent spirit of doing something in the face of other people. What might this be like? Right. And then if he's able to do something and see what those consequences or those responses are, then he really does have more of an empowered choice how he's going to respond. It's like having a toolbox and you have this one tool that's your favorite tool that does a lot of great stuff all the time, but sometimes you come up against things that tool or those few tools will not fix. It doesn't mean you have to completely ignore those and never use them again, but maybe you can try out a couple of others every once in a while and see what it does for you. So you still have that identity that's set and not dismissed, but you can always maybe try something else sometime every once in a while, and it's always his choice.
So, when we were talking about these proxemics and
Kinesthetics? Oh, kinesics. Yeah.
so those things are not necessarily things that are taught. They're more just like you develop them and kind of attach them from your family to the people that you're around. Something that I notice a lot with clients is like if there's like a blended family. So maybe the parent who has done a lot of the parenting for the last 10 years is not around, and now they're with a different family member. It's a family member, but they don't necessarily know all of these things are happening, and
Yep.
how do you help point that out? Because it's like, they're so minute and they're so subversive that you're